Working with my dad that close was really cool. Just thinking about it, I know how special it is even at 18. There are memories that can't be exchanged or forgotten.
I love that my son and I did this. I care about the history. I care about that boy. This is a story that him and I and other people that we care about put our blood, sweat, and tears in because we wanted to save it for other people.
I'm Logan Lawson.
And I'm Corey Lawson.
And this car matters.
We were going to leave this out. Truth is, most people don't care. But we have grown to admire and feel affection for the men that we've written about. We have sat in their company, eaten dinner, slept in their homes, and felt their emotions and vulnerabilities firsthand. Most of them only had loved one woman their entire lives, and their families deserve better. They cooked chicken for us, supported us with time-demanding personal videos, and donated their life's legacy of confidential documents. Most of the historical points are already shown, but here is the remainder.
History books give Frank Pavliks and Sam Romano the vast majority of the credit for designing and building the lunar rover. Google it. It's everywhere. That's the equivalent of my son being accepted to Cal Poly and thanking no one but himself. The truth is, the General Motors Defense and Research Laboratories were in charge of all aspects of this program until they grew impatient waiting on NASA around the end of 1967. Frank and Sam's skeleton crew had been left behind for finishing touches on this program when the entire electric drive division had been relocated back to Warren. That was done because this program was already ready for implementation.
The patent, the research, the early development, and the reliability testing had already been achieved for the electric drive division, and that work had begun in early 1961. How can the history books get the timeline so wrong and overlook so many for the credit in design and development? We found the answers in the unpublished memoirs of their superior, Mr. Donald Friedman.
These guys were close. I mean, these buddies ate lunch together once a week until Don passed away. All of them had everyone's phone numbers, and they even shared vacation time together during this research. Not only did they stay close for 50 years, but many of them helped bury their friends. So how could so many men's involvement be omitted all these years? The answer was non-disclosure agreements and the newspapers of Santa Barbara.
Don recounted the tumultuous days when the entire division was being relocated back to Warren. When he had returned back to Santa Barbara after his time at General Motors to start his new venture minicars, the papers had mistakenly given Frank and Sam the vast majority of the credit for the program and the speed of which it was undertaken. The story of this development had been abridged to begin in 1969 and focused on two men, when it actually began in 1961 and involved many others. These newspaper articles had catapulted Frank and Sam to rock star status locally, and Don didn't have the heart to derail it.
You would think over the years that someone would have set the record straight, but compartmentalized structure made this difficult, and non-disclosure agreements scared these men into the latter years of their lives. Along the way, Frank's career exploded into the history books and even included involvement in the Mars rover. With his loss of 2 wives to cancer and Sam's involvement with Don's new ventures, the rest of these buddies just resigned themselves to sinking into historical oblivion.
The closest the story had ever got to being told correctly was in a recent Science Channel documentary. But again, the early years were omitted, and the vast majority of the credit for development was assumed to be Frank, Sam, Delco Products, and Boeing. Frank and Sam got individual credit for their efforts, but their remaining creation, research, design, development, and testing achieved by everyone else was funneled to Delco Products Division and Sam Romano. Not exactly fair when you're reminiscing about your life's accomplishments or creating a resume along the way. But like I said, these guys were close, and friendship was a powerful bond.
Now let's be clear. Frank and Sam did help build the final lunar rover in approximately 17 months. But it was the 8 years that had come before that made General Motors the winner of the contract. All of the other corporate interest in the lunar rover contracts were at a disadvantage of almost a decade. However, Frank and Sam did tenaciously sell the idea to Dr. von Braun, and Frank did build that real-life toy model on his own money that convinced NASA to listen to his pitch. But Don's memoirs clearly state that General Motors had the ability to build the exact same final build in 1967 if they had received the same specs that Sam and Frank received that fateful day.
And to make the evidence even more overwhelming than it already is, NASA gave a thank you of sorts to Mr. Dr. Paul Agarwal for the Electric Drive Division's involvement. This was achieved through a private exercise that allowed Agarwal to brief retired astronaut John Glenn at the General Motors Research Laboratories on the control functioning of these systems. This briefing was documented to happen 5 months prior to the Apollo mission with the lunar rover on board.
This leads us to the next proverbial rock in our shoe. Google corporate credit for the lunar rover, and Boeing is listed as the primary victor. While true, it was done on purpose. The lunar rover was conceptualized from the very beginning by the men of the General Motors Defense and Research Laboratories, but was only given credit for the mobility systems as a subcontractor. To this day, when we ask the men that were there, what's left of the lunar rover after the omission of the mobility systems, we get the same response: not much. Scientific instruments and the ability to communicate are about the extent of it. Well, Don Friedman's memoirs explain that too.
When General Motors learned that Frank had been successful in his pitch to Dr. von Braun, they also learned that it would be necessary to construct a single-use building that simulated the atmospheric conditions of the moon. They would then have to retest for reliability in that atmosphere to gain final acceptance aboard the Apollo missions. Well, they had no desire to build a one-time use building that simulated these conditions, but Boeing, they already had one. So, they sold the cooperation to Boeing and continued as the lead subcontractor to eliminate the problem. Boeing would go on to historically document the final lunar roving vehicle at great length, and that wouldn't include the 8 years spent by General Motors prior.
Another history book anomaly is General Motors' reluctance to enter the high-performance market with the delayed testing and development of the 1967 Z28. The mock-up and testing of the prototype testbeds for this program are correctly documented as beginning with the Riverside Z28 on October 11, 1966, when the General Assembly at the Norwood plant had begun producing the Camaro lineup over 2 months earlier.
This perceived delay of over 2 months was not because of reluctance. This package was originally envisioned to be mocked up and tested during the summer in 1966. This would allow the high-performance package to be marketed and released at the same time as the public unveil of the entire product line. But the 4 prototype testbed deliveries to the General Motors experimental garage were delayed because of their interim usage by the Electric Drive Division for lunar mobility reliability testing.
The next issue we have is with the conspiracy theories that have made the assertions that General Motors' interests have aligned with big oil companies over the years. Like they acquired or created some magic technology and failed to pursue it. On the contrary, it was the weight and cost that were the only factors that eliminated feasibility. The weight of these components affected the handling of these automobiles, and the silver zinc battery technology created for these programs were expensive and short-lived. Just the battery for Electrovera 1 cost over $12,000 and had a life expectancy of approximately 24,000 miles. But they could sell the gas version as a completed automobile for around $2,500 and expected it to last for well over 100,000 miles.
These technological hurdles seemed within reach at the time, so General Motors continued to allow the men of this research to pursue advancements far beyond these programs. These were programs no longer funded by congressional passage of Clean Air Acts that General Motors continued with at their own expense for several decades. This would become a famous endeavor with the state of California's mandate for the development of the EV program that seemed to be successful. That public success would not account for the lack of feasibility and consumer costs to purchase the vehicles. So, when the cars were returned from their leases and destroyed, the public opposition became newsworthy. I wonder if they would have purchased these cars at the General Motors cost basis of over $100,000 when a competing gas version could be procured for around $15,000.
We live in a time where hating big corporations is the status quo, but this research proves a totally different perception. All the way back to the 1960s, General Motors knew the potential of electric and hybrid cars. They not only pursued these potentials, but encouraged it within their ranks. However, if the consumer-driven program would not make money, it was shelved and archived. This didn't stop others from thinking it was possible, but they did not have the luxury of hundreds of feasibility accountants within the employ of General Motors. But regardless of what feasibility studies concluded about consumer-driven programs, General Motors encouraged the competition that they recognized could change the world.
Case in point, when Donald Friedman was reassigned to be the head of the commercial division from the General Motors Defense Laboratories in 1967, his efforts continued on several mass transit systems. The one that involved the least amount of public infrastructure was a fleet of electric and hybrid miniature cars that could be owned by a municipality and utilized within a rideshare format. The idea was sold in Philadelphia, and Don returned to General Motors with a signed contract and a deposit check in the name of the General Motors Research Laboratories.
When this project was deemed to be potentially unprofitable or at high risk for failure by the feasibility accountants, General Motors didn't kill the plan. Instead, they offered the assigned contract and the money to the man that had originally envisioned the idea, Donald Frieden. Additionally, they supported his new endeavor, Minicars Inc., by paying him all of his accrued bonuses in one lump sum upon his departure. The following week, Minicars was born in the basement of their home in Warren, Michigan. It would ultimately fail in Santa Barbara, with many of the men that were involved in the Lunar Rover program at the helm of Don and Rachel's new company.
But for the record, it was because of feasibility. And now that the technology supports the success of these new programs, General Motors has pursued a state-of-the-art rideshare program known as the Maven brand. Combined with the consumer success of the Chevy Bolt and Volt, it would seem that many of these ideas from the 1960s have finally reached the consumer development stages. So to my many friends that first dreamed up these ideas 50 years ago, thanks guys, your story is now told.
Logan is the founder of Pilot Car Registry. His website and research has been showcased on hundreds of news outlets across the country. The website that he created, pilotcarregistry.com, has received national acclaim for its documentation of many General Motors programs that had long been forgotten. Logan is considered a subject matter expert on General Motors prototypes as well as the General Motors electric drive programs of the 1960s and 70s. The preceding research has started as an advanced placement project for him at Bueller High School in Hutchinson, Kansas. His vision of this project has led to the ultimate credit that should have been bestowed on the men of this thesis years ago. Corey is the proud father of Logan Lawson, the founder of Pilot Car Registry. Earlier within this research, he realized that Logan had stumbled upon a project that would require the assistance of professionals within their field. He would continue to support Logan on this thesis, and on occasion would perform interviews of the men that lived these programs while Logan was attending school. Operating in the context of a historian, Corey has contributed to the documentation and publishing of works that are showcased on pilotcarregistry.com, as well as publishing numerous papers that have been published on these subjects. Jamie is an accomplished researcher that specializes in law enforcement databases. She is solely responsible for finding and making contact with all the men and women that are written about in this thesis. With an extensive background on the subject, she is able to find these men and women from just their commonly held names. With many projects already completed, this accomplished entrepreneur is currently acting as a research coordinator for additional projects on pilotcarregistry.com. Tyler is an accomplished cinematographer with a background on the production of documentaries. His finalized editing procedures are showcased on over 100 different videos that were published by Pilot Car Registry. These videos involved extensive travel to film the subject matter, as well as demanding production deadlines. These projects spanned a period of approximately 3 years and are credited by the company that he founded, Corp Productions.